Timeliness of reclamation has been in the news over the last few years. Just some of the topics that people have been worried about is that the growing number of abandoned wells in the province of Alberta aren't being worked on and reclaimed timely. So wanted to just kind of have a lunch and learn to share some of the experience that I've had over the last few years as a consultant and as working for an oil and gas industry. Just to share some basic information. I'm sure most of you already know it, but just to put it all together in one presentation. So I work for Trace. Christine introduced myself. So I'm the Director of Operations. Trace, our vision is to be the most respected and trusted specialized environmental consulting firm in Western Canada. We're over 65 team members, 5 offices in Alberta and Saskatchewan, and we're employee owned. Myself was introduced already, but I grew up on a mixed farm southwest of Stettler. On that farm, we had oil and gas assets, from well sites to batteries to pipeline risers. So I was aware growing up of the oil and gas industry within the farming practice. I consulted for a total between my previous consulting firm and Trace for 8 years, and I also worked downtown Calgary for 6 years. So what is reclamation? It's a CLRA lunch and learn, so I'm sure everyone here knows that, but there may be a few individuals here that don't. So reclamation, as defined in the Alberta Environment Protection and Enhancement Act, defines reclamation to mean any or all of the following. So removal of equipment, decontamination of buildings and land, stabilizing, contouring, and reclaiming the surface. So that's the definition in the Act. The Act is what drives the reclamation business in Alberta. Within there's a duty to reclaim specified land. As part of the process, you have to obtain a reclamation certificate to be released from that surface caveat, and you must meet equivalent land capability. So equivalent land capability is for the ability of that land to support land use after reclamation that is similar. So it doesn't have to be exactly, but it has to be similar. So timeliness. Definition on Wikipedia is occurring at a suitable or opportune time. So I have underlined suitable because I think it's important on what is suitable. Is what's suitable to industry, what's suitable to a landowner, what's suitable to a regulator, to the public, all a little bit different. So roadblocks are obviously any hindrance along the way for us as an industry to reclaim sites timely. So why is it important? The blue is abandoned wells that have not yet been certified or exempted, and the pink line is abandoned wells in the province that have been reclaimed, certified, and exempted. So I'm sure all of you have seen this graph previously. It's been out there for a few years, but the main message is that the number of abandoned wells that have not been REC certified yet appears to be growing. So there's growing concern that maybe things aren't being worked on as timely as they should be, as suitable. Why it's also important is that the number of wells being drilled in the province of Alberta has been going up over the last few years. Maybe not so much this last year with the economic situation, but the number of wells being drilled in the provinces are really escalating. So there needs to be a focus on our ability to get through reclamation sites timely and as fast as we can to help manage this growing backlog of work that should be coming. So who's involved? In reclamation, there's a million stakeholders that could become involved along the process. Grouped into 4 categories: landowners, regulators, industry, consultants. What's involved? First step is getting the well abandoned. That's the first step. Once you have the well abandoned, the next step is to remove those buildings and facilities from that surface lease. Today's talk is going to be more of a focus on oil and gas and more of a focus on private land, because that's most of my experience. There's a whole different presentation I could put together on public land or mining or other industries, but focus is going to be oil and gas on private land. So getting the well abandoned, the facilities removed, making sure that the site becomes decontaminated, and then after that, making sure that the site becomes reclaimed back to an equivalent land capability. So some may know the steps along the way. If not, I wanted to explain a few of the concept as well if you're not aware. So well abandonment in that definition within the industry includes two steps. One is the downhole work associated with that wellbore of getting things cemented off and bridge plugged and safe and secured downhole so that there's no future incidents into the future. Once you have the downhole abandonment completed, the next step is to actually have that wellbore cut and capped near surface so that there's no surface hindrance to reclamation moving forward for that well. So the downhole is on the left and the surface abandonment's on the right. Facility decommissioning, so that includes just getting everything that's on the surface off. So that includes tanks and buildings and risers and pilings and a million other different things. So the next step, decontamination. If you're in the reclamation business, you already know what a phase 1 and a phase 2 and remediation are. But a phase 1, if you don't know, is just a background review of all the history of that well site to determine if there's any areas of potential environmental concern that we should assess. The phase 2 is actually the assessment of soil and groundwater conditions to make sure and determine if decontamination is required. Remediation includes the decontamination process, and that can be either above ground or in ground, which is ex situ and in situ. And then reclamation, again, returning that surface to equivalent land capability. And once you've done that steps, you currently, in the current system, put together a 1 to 300 page document that goes to your client and to the landowner and to the regulators. So a lot of paper gets pushed along the way to capture all that great work that was done historically at that site. So my friends at the AR can probably appreciate all that paperwork. So roadblocks. When you have multiple stakeholders and you have multiple steps, obviously there's going to be roadblocks along the way. So during my time at Penn West, is where I was before joining Trace, there was probably about 30 or 40 departments that would get involved when it came time to determine whether a well should get abandoned, if a facility should get decommissioned. So it included lawyers and operations and surface land and mineral land, our acquisition and development group, accounting, regulatory, our environmental group, many others, all wanted to have a say in what should get abandoned, why, when, where. So timely process, lots of roadblocks internally to have all those people get together on the same page and come up with a plan long term. So lots of challenges there. Who's involved? Landowners. So my father owns about a 5,000 acre farm southwest of Stettler with lots of oil and gas. Lots of stakeholders are involved in the landowner side of reclamation. So they also have their own lawyers, their own accountants, their own occupants, their neighbors, family members, all who want to have somewhat of a say into how they want sites reclaimed or if they want them reclaimed. And then consultants. So at Trace, you need to have lots of experts that manage a lot of the phases of phase 1, phase 2, decontamination and reclamation. So you need drilling waste specialists, soil experts, water experts, GIS experts, veg people, authors, senior reviewers, word processing, accountants, lawyers, lots of stakeholders internally to get the product out and to submit a Rec Cert app. So there's lots of stakeholders along the way that are involved. So well abandonment. Why does it take so long for the oil and gas company to decide to abandon a well? And why do all those different groups as part of the industry stakeholders want to be involved? So there's lots of future upside that could be at these well sites in the future. If you've had problems with the landowner in the past, you may not want to give up that surface lease because that gives you right of entry to that site in the future. So if you want to drill another well on that surface lease sometime in the future because you think your zone is going to produce, you don't want to give up that surface lease because your ability to get that into the future may be a challenge with that landowner. There's mineral rights, which are below the ground that oil and gas companies purchase and manage, and sometimes they have wells drilled into those minerals and want to keep them operational so that they can retain mineral rights. Even though the well may not be economical, they want to retain the right to produce from that mineral zone. Well economics, so when the price of gas is $2 and the price of oil is $40, it's probably uneconomical to produce a lot of the wells in the province that are older and have heavy water. As the price of oil jumps to $100 and gas to $5, the economics change, and a lot of those wells would be turned back on and produced at oil and gas. So those change, those fluctuate. It's hard to predict, so oil and gas companies are apprehensive of abandoning a well in case the economics do come up and that well becomes viable again. And technology changes as well. Over the last 5 years, multi-stage fracking, horizontal wells have really changed how oil and gas has been developed in the province, where a lot of the old fields that were drilled vertically and produced from the 50s and 60s, now that if you can come in and drill horizontally into those zones, you can produce old fields like Drayton Valley and Swan Hills once again. So people are unsure of what the next 10 years will bring into some of these older fields, so they may not want to get rid of the well in case there's future upside there. So, and well abandonment does not produce oil and gas. That makes money for oil and gas companies. It's a cost, and if oil and gas companies can prolong abandoning a well due to the cost, they may choose to do that. Because sometimes when older wells, they can become very expensive to abandon. If you have gas migration or surface casing vent flow problems, they can be $1, $2, $3 million to abandon per well. Some aren't that expensive, but some can. You never know until you rig up on a well and start getting into it how challenging it's going to be and expensive. Facility decommissioning, why does this part take so long? Why is that tank still sitting on that site for 20 years? Some of those facilities have to stay. Something like an active pipeline riser that connects an operating pipeline system, it's going to stay there until the life of that pipeline system is no longer needed. Some can go, some of that equipment is reusable, and some of it's not. I mentioned the active pipeline risers. This is probably one of the bigger roadblocks as part of facility decommissioning, is a lot of these well sites have pipeline riser systems that are used to pig and purge and to manage pipeline systems. So they don't want to get rid of those risers because it gives them access to their pipelines underground. So even though the well gets abandoned, all the facilities get removed, that riser may sit in perpetuity for that site. And once it's there, you can't reclaim a site and get a rec cert because of that riser, unless you do some surface survey and realignment and all that stuff. So challenging. Reusable equipment. In industry, you need to figure out, what equipment do I have? Is it usable? Where would it be usable? Who are our working interest partners? If we can find a new home for that facility, how do I internally do a material transfer to move that dehy from this site to the next site? That takes a long time. You have to consider, if you're going to transfer from one well where you are a 50% working interest partner with someone else to another well that you own 100%, there's cost considerations that you need to be able to pay your working interest partner. So oil and gas companies have very long lists of equipment that they can reuse. They need time to figure out where that can go once you drill it. And in the meantime, it's easier to store that equipment on the abandoned site than it is to send a truck there to pick it up, to take it back to their boneyard until they figure it out. So equipment does stay there for a while until that step takes them. Could be years, it could be months, it could be decades. So equipment that can be removed is pipeline risers that are no longer needed. We call these Y-lateral risers, that from an active pipeline riser, they take a Y shape up to the abandoned well. So when you abandon a well, you no longer need this little segment of pipeline, but in order for you to abandon this little segment of pipeline, you have to shut in the bigger pipeline system. So that becomes a challenge for oil and gas companies too, because they don't want to shut in production, shut in operation of operating pipelines, because it has economical effects. So in order to abandon a YLAT, you need to shut down the pipeline system, obtain temporary workspace from landowners, you have to flare gas, you have to pig and purge these lines, you have to open them up, you have to cut them off, tag them as abandoned. So they take a long time, and depending on how complex your pipeline system is, it could be easy or it could be very, very difficult. And some of the equipment, if it's not usable, like a tank, you have to be very careful on how you dispose of that. You have to be assessing for asbestos, you have to assess for norms to make sure when you're getting rid of this equipment it's managed appropriately. So a lot of the old gas plants have asbestos wrapped equipment that takes a long time to abate before you can move that equipment off there safely. So phase ones, why does a phase one take so long? Takes a long time for industry to figure out if they own the well. And that's usually determined by a mineral land contract somewhere buried in some file in their system that they have to track down. So you have to mine through all the contracts to figure out, do they own this well? And if I do, what is the working interest that I'm responsible for? So that takes a long time. You need mineral land agents to be able to go through that stuff, and a lot of stuff along the way gets sold and bought, and information gets lost. A lot of the well site, facility, surface land file information is housed in hard files that are bought and sold, that are transferred between companies and put in boxes in the hallway that sometimes get lost. And so a lot of this information just get lost, and oil and gas companies are working off of very little information of what happened at that site previously. So phase two is more on the consulting side. Why do phase twos take so long? It's very difficult to find some source areas on our sites, sometimes like finding a needle in a haystack. Probably one of the more difficult ones for us to find are drilling waste disposal areas that fail the compliance option checklist, and we just never know how that sump was constructed or if it ever was. So we poke holes around the site trying to figure out if something's there, and sometimes we find them, sometimes we don't. If we do assessments, we do analytical, and we try and figure out, is this site have anthropogenic impacts or is it natural? And there's varying degrees of interpretation to that, and it takes a professional judgment on what's natural and what's not, and what maybe can be left in place with a bit of risk management. So there's challenges there, and that takes time to have those proper discussions with all the experts within each of the consulting firms and industry. And criteria has changed as well. So a lot of the work that's been done historically was done to different criteria as they changed along the ways, and you need to be able to review all the background information, get an idea for the current state of that site, did it meet the criteria of the day, and are we fine to move forward with the condition, or do we need to move towards remediation? Remediation, why does that take so long? In the province of Alberta, with our weather system and our soils, our remediation options are limited. They are time consuming depending on the complexity of the project. If it's very large, it can take years to remediate. They're also very costly, so they can be. If you decide to do a big land filling job on a big sump, it costs money to truck, and it costs money to excavate, and it costs money to dispose of those at a proper Class 2 landfill. Tier 1 is often not attainable based on just site conditions, and some of our criteria are fairly risk adverse. And then Tier 2 is starting to get steam in our industry right now, but there's a bit of reluctance from industry to go down that road quite yet. But it is getting steam, and it's going to get better. But that takes time for us to have dialogue with the industry to try and prioritize where money's going to go, and if you can reclaim 100 sites for $100,000 or remediate one, most of the time they're going to go to reclamation type work. Reclamation, that's the topic today, the untimeliness of reclamation. Why does it take so long? So the first thing you need to do is determine what needs to be reclaimed. Every single well site is different, and every single time I open up one, they're different. Some have multiple access roads, well site additions, temporary workspace, dugouts, campsites, remote sumps, overlapping activities, especially in the green zone where people are using the same road to access multiple well sites. The picture here is just a hand drawing that I did to try and figure out one well site that we were reclaiming, and there was 8 different ways that site was reclaimed or accessed. The surveyed access road, the resurveyed access road where the landowner wanted to go, where the new landowner wanted them to go, where they went a couple of years, where they went for the abandonment, where they went for the facility decommissioning, all different. So when you use those, you got to go out and assess them and make sure there's no reclamation required. So you got to review all the background information and try and hand sketch something so you can figure out how to approach that site. So that takes time for sure. And not to me, like there's remote sumps out there that have multiple wells, and all a challenge to figure out. So why does it take so long? You need to determine how to reclaim it. So you send one individual out, you need to assess the landscape condition of that site, the soil condition of that site, and the vegetation condition. It'd be nice if you had 3 heads that knew all that stuff, but it's a challenge for someone to be an expert in all 3 of those, to assess the sites, to figure out what needs to happen, because there's difficult landscape situations, there's solonesic soils that have their own issues, there's native prairie vegetation that takes a long time to assess and to plan for and to reclaim, all taking time, with a lot of feedback from the field staff to the office staff to the seniors to make sure that what you're doing makes sense scientifically and also will get us our biggest bang for the buck for timing. Once you figure out what you need to reclaim, you need to reclaim it. And there's a million steps to get a piece of equipment on a well site to actually be able to reclaim it. So you need to do your ground disturbance due diligence, you need crossing agreements that can take anywhere between 4 to 6 weeks to 6 months, depending on who it is. You got to figure out from your client who your approved vendors are. You got to call the vendor, see who's available, making sure that person's available is competent, making sure their equipment's clean, making sure you have them out to site safely, and you hope for perfect weather along the way. You hope it doesn't rain. And then when you start moving the sites, you'll find lots of different things buried on sites that'll throw wrenches along the way, of buried school buses or skidoos or topsoil buried on the access road. So all cause a challenge. And you need to get veg to grow. Cereal crops are very easily. Landowners quickly seed those sites and they grow and usually meet criteria within 1 to 2 years. Tame pasture, established fairly quickly. You can have them established and REC certified usually in 2 to 4 years. The biggest challenge by far is the native prairie sites. A lot of the wells that are going through the abandonment phase are shallow natural gas wells in high native prairie areas. So a lot of the metrics that are growing on that previous slide come in the native prairie area. So native prairie takes the longest to establish and get it to REC certification stage, and a lot of the wells are that type. So that's going to lead us to be untimely again, because construction practices historically have destroyed some of the topsoil, destroyed some of the native prairie. Weeds encroach very quickly and they're hard to eradicate. It takes a long time. So weeds are tough. I hate weeds. Roadblocks on the industry's perspective. Economic times change. A lot of the third quarter results will be coming out from our oil and gas friends, and a lot of tough times will be communicated and a lot of layoffs. So tough times, when it's good, they're going good and everything's happy, but when it's tough, it's a challenge. With lower economic oil, their capital budgets are smaller, the priorities internally at an oil and gas company are different. Less money may be assigned to the environmental portfolio and more to drilling and completions to bring up production. Lots of times coordinators change companies, coordinators change areas, coordinators change service type. So a lot of times we'll establish a relationship with someone, it'll change, and we'll have to reestablish and build a system of timely reclaiming sites, which can be a challenge. Budgets change, and working interest partners throw a wrench in it as well. So if you have a working interest partner that is a small oil and gas company with not a lot of money, they're going to push back on a lot of these abandonment, decommissioning, reclamation projects, because they just don't want to put a lot of money to that. So larger firms with better abandonment and reclamation programs often have a challenge of working with working interest partners to get approval for us to move forward with that work. So that can be anywhere between a week to a month to a year, getting AFEs approved depending on the size of it. Roadblocks from landowners. Landowners like that surface rental. They usually use oil and gas, at least my father does, that oil and gas rental stuff to travel. So they can use their little tools and tricks to keep that surface rental as long as possible. They can also refuse the access if they haven't been having a good dynamic with the oil and gas company. They can just flat out refuse you from going and come out and with a gun on the back of their quad and make you leave, and that's happened before too. So. Landowners are hard to contact. I know my dad avoids picking up the phone and avoids people driving into his yard just so that he doesn't have to talk about these things over and over again. So, some fly south for the winter, so you may contact them asking them for a release. They may be gone to Phoenix for the next 6 months. So either you fly down or you send a surface land agent down to get a release signed, or you wait until they come back and you can track them down too. Probably the biggest challenge that we face in reclamation is working around the farm schedule on cultivated sites. Oil and gas companies and consultants want to be good neighbors, so you want to try and work with them as much as possible to do your work before seeding or after harvest. And in a year like this, where harvest doesn't end until 2 weeks ago, doesn't give us a big window to come in and reclaim sites after. So even though oil and gas companies have paid a surface rental and you have surface rights access into that site to disturb it anyways, most of them avoid it just to be a good neighbor that way. So it slows the process down. You may lose years in your reclamation process just trying to be a good neighbor that way. So that's a challenge as well. Landowners do change as well, and change often. There's different farm managers. He may own the land but have his brother managing it, or his cousin. So you have to be able to try and contact each of them to get their feedback on the end land use and releases and all that stuff. That can be a challenge. Sometimes sites go into an estate executor and it sits in perpetuity for a while until they get the asset and the estate figured out. Land is just pure sold, and it takes a long time for the new person to get on the title and for us to track down the contact information and to find out the new landowner, what would you like done with that access road that the old landowner wanted to be left in place. And they have changes in expectations too. So sometimes they'll want that road 1 year, and then you go back in the spring to get the release and they actually change their mind, have broken that quarter, and now want the access road gone. So we work on good faith. We try and get releases as often as possible, but sometimes good faith changes, and we have to be adaptable to that too, because the landowner is always right. Some landowners want to do the reclamation themselves. They're worried about third-party equipment coming on their land and bringing weeds and club roots, and sometimes they take a stance that only their disc can disc that well site, or only their rotospick can rotospick that site, or only their tractor can reclaim that site. So we have to, most oil and gas clients of ours, they have health and safety rules that are pretty specific, and most landowners can't meet that expectation. So, and landowners are definitely, obviously, hesitant to retain liability. So when they sign a release, they're worried about if in the future this will ever come back on me and me signing this release for this access road through a low wet area. They're definitely worried about liability, subsurface contamination, and are always worried that they may not want to sign off on the phase 2 or the remediation work just because they're unsure of who has the liability into the future, even though we explain to them that polluter pays, its liability retains with the industry. And club root is probably one of the bigger issues that are coming up right now for cultivated sites, and landowners definitely are cautious of allowing third-party people onto their quarters just because they're worried of club root infestation, even though it may already be there. So as a consultant, things change. We are constantly bombarded with changes in forms, criteria, landowners, changes in budgets, changes in coordinators, changes in approved vendors, changes in health and safety requirements. Everything that I said before we're challenged with. So we have to be very adaptable in what we're doing and work with our stakeholders, and when we have a short window to do work, we have to be prepared to move quickly on it, because weather, budget, information, access, all can be very, very short. There's a new regulator, even though it's not new. It's been a couple of years since the ADR has been leading this work, but a lot of the reviews of RCAs and feedback from our regulators on non-routine applications can be a little non-timely as well, and I know that they're working on the timeliness and the management of all the data of the 100 to 300 page rec cert apps is very difficult for them to manage if you have 2,500 being submitted each year to that organization. So timely reclamation involves many stakeholders, many stages, multiple roadblocks. You definitely need a strong consultant to see them coming. So that's the little plug for Trace Associates. So.